Our next speaker, Alex Wang, who's on our faculty here at UCLA, is a go-to expert on comparative environmental law, with a particular focus on China. His deep knowledge of China's government agencies, the legal community, and environmental policies give him an incredible vantage point on global risks, regulation, and opportunity that few others can possibly have. He lived for a number of years in Beijing and actually headed NRDC's office there. He also worked as a Fulbright Fellow in China and was a founding director of the China Environmental Law and Governance Project. I will say, too, that when I made my first trip to China as dean, I literally could not have done it without Alex, who was an incredible guide to the complex and totally fascinating culture that where I couldn't speak a darn word. And Alex's scholarship is already making a very significant mark in these fields, and his work is really an amazing example of the ways that faculty are connecting with very important issues of the day. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Alex Wang.
Good evening. It's wonderful to be here, and thanks for your talk. That was very inspirational and a tough act to follow. So it's nice to be here tonight. In my brief time here, I want to talk to you a little bit about China's rise in the rule of law. I don't think I need to make the case why China is important. I think it's not a controversial thing to say that China is probably the most important country-to-country relationship that we have, and China is obviously the most populous nation in the world, and now really the main rival to the U.S. in economic might. What I think has been interesting to me is how Western views of China have been remarkably polarized. Actually, there's been a long debate that's really, in fact, gone on for centuries with two kind of polar opposite views of China. On one hand, people think of China as sort of despotic and authoritarian and a country that needs to be checked and changed. And then on the other side, some people say, well, China is enlightened and has a sort of way of doing things that is unique to itself and perhaps is even worthy of emulation. And even back in Enlightenment days, thinkers were having this argument about China. So I want to engage with this a little bit, and I think I want to take it from a somewhat, what I hope is a somewhat unexpected angle. I want to tell you about the trajectory of China's rise by reflecting on the study of Chinese law here at UCLA Law. You might not realize this, but among US law schools, UCLA Law has one of the longest and most sustained kind of engagements in the study of Chinese law. So I want to take us back to the founding of UCLA Law. I don't know if you all knew, but Roscoe Pound, the former dean of Harvard Law School, was a professor here at UCLA for a few years until 1953. And he actually learned to speak Chinese at the age of 76 in 1946 because he went to China at that time to advise Chiang Kai-shek on legal reform. And didn't go so well for the nationalists. They were kicked out and the communists took over, but Roscoe Pound came to UCLA right after that. And I am told, I don't know this for sure, but I'm told that he taught some Chinese law here. And I don't know if it's completely true, but I don't mind putting myself in a lineage that includes Roscoe Pound. But one part of the point here is to think that, think of China back at that time. China had been racked by foreign invasion and internal strife for over a century at that point. Since the early 1800s, what was known as the century of humiliation had a deep impact on the national psyche of a people who had long thought of themselves as the center of the world, right? China literally in Chinese means middle kingdom, 中国, right? So thought of themselves as the center of the world. And because of that long tradition, many Chinese people actually felt that this period of the century of humiliation was really an interregnum, something that was passing, and that China would rise again to wealth and power. And this narrative is very much part of what Chinese leaders currently talk about with Chinese citizens today, that the party's in the act of restoring China to its traditional rightful place in the world. But that rise would have to wait for a little bit, right? So for the next 3 decades, from the 50s to the 70s, There was a remarkable amount of internal strife and chaos in China, the Great Leap Forward with millions of people dying from famine, the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. Chinese universities and law schools essentially shut down, completely dismantled. A generation lost the chance to get an education, and this was a period for Westerners that we could only know about China from the outside. No one could really, or at least Americans certainly could not really set foot. My next predecessor at UCLA was Professor Bill Alford. Did anyone have Professor Alford? He was here in the 80s and until the very beginning of the 90s. It may not have overlapped with the class of 92. I'm pandering to the class of 92. So he was here to teach Chinese law, and I presume at the time UCLA brought him on because of the opportunities brought about by the opening of China in 1978, right? This Deng Xiaoping's so-called reform and opening period. And this was the beginning of one of the greatest kind of social transformations that, of any population of people that the world has really ever seen. And I think Professor Alford took advantage of these opportunities to engage with China. He brought Chinese professors over to the US and engaged with them on the project of essentially building China's legal system from scratch. And one of the themes that Professor Alford dealt with at the time was this, again, this age-old debate. Is China sort of primitive and despotic, or are they enlightened and more capable than we think? In other words, are they friend or foe, to put it another way? And he had an influential piece in the California Law Review at the time that critiqued the traditional Western, what he thought were Western misconceptions of China, this conventional wisdom that imperial China was lawless and primitive. And he showed how China had other systems other than the sort of legal institutions we were used to, sophisticated bureaucratic systems that played many of the roles that formal law and legal institutions played in our country. And his work was also a reminder that Westerners have tended to orientalize China and to view them as inferior and in need of saving from themselves. And he showed that some of this was due to a misunderstanding of what was actually going on the ground. Now, my next and most recent predecessor at UCLA was Professor Randy Purim. I don't think he overlapped with the class of 92. But to him, the misunderstanding of China was not only about misunderstanding of facts on the ground, but also based on an incorrect assumption that the only values that could possibly have legitimacy in other countries were the sort of liberal democratic values that we hold dear in the United States. And I think one of Randy's great contributions was to interrogate the meaning of rule of law. He showed that in China there were a diversity of views about rule of law. Some people had more liberal democratic views, but many mainstream leaders had the view that of what he called statist socialist rule of law that focused more on economic development, less on social rights, more interest in state intervention, less interest in markets, and certainly less interest in checks on state power. And he argued that this version of rule of law was more likely to gain prominence in China than any liberal democratic notion of law that Americans typically had in mind. And this notion, when he raised it, was sort of surprising, but in a way it shouldn't be surprising, given we're familiar with contentious politics in our own country these days. It shouldn't be surprising that half a world away that we run into very different politics and values, right? But we should also remember the context in which Randy was arguing. He began pursuing these themes in the 1990s, and what was happening during that time? So there was nothing less than the feeling that communism and a certain type of non-democratic rule was about to collapse, right? We had Tiananmen Square, major political crisis in China, and the collapse of the Soviet Union and all the satellite communist states, and people were at that time talking about really nothing less than the end of history, that the world was heading towards democracy inexorably. And so if you think back to what was going on with China at that time, US engagement with China paused for a few years, but then re-engagement began again in the early 90s. That was the time when the sort of outsourcing revolution to China really began. If you think Walmart began outsourcing out of China in 1993, opened its first store in China in 1996. China joined the WTO just a few years later in 2001. And we see the results for China, right? This is GDP growth from the 60s to just a few years ago, and you see the benefits that had for China and China's rise. And part of the justification for the engagement at that time was political as well. This thought that if we engage with China, help them to become wealthier, develop a middle class, political change would come as well. And US programs on rule of law and human rights were created to try to nudge China in what we felt was a more productive direction. And there was a widely held sense that the US could change China through engagement and economic interaction. And I think one of Randy Purim's contributions would argue quite convincingly that this ability to change China was not necessarily the case. So my engagement with China, most sustained engagement with China began in 2004. And I don't know if you remember 2004. The early 2000s was sort of an awakening of US interest in engagement with China. It was the year that all of these magazines that have sort of almost disappeared by now ran China's century covers, and a lot of books came out talking about how it was the Chinese century. People began to take notice of China's rise, right? It became known that China's economic rise had lifted 400 million people out of poverty. There was a rising middle class, a booming economy that averaged more than 10% a year since 1978, and Chinese people had more choices than ever before. At the same time, critics of China worried that this focus on the successes was obscuring a lot of the problems of authoritarian rule. The critics focused on Chinese censorship, social control, violations of human rights, and all the other attendant problems that come with a system that had limited checks on power and a very precautionary, conservative approach to state security. In my work during that time, from 2004 on, I was a lawyer for NRDC, the environmental group on the ground, brought me in contact with both of these sides of China. So I traveled all around the country, worked with regulators, lawyers, NGOs, academics, and businesses. And my job naturally had a political side. We were advocating for environmental and political and social change in China. And in particular, I worked on some relatively more sensitive issues like transparency, public participation, public interest litigation, that sort of thing. And what I saw was, on one hand, the reality of a by no means perfect, but quite sophisticated bureaucracy that was working for change. I worked with a lot of good people who really wanted to make China a better place. But I also certainly saw the downsides, the ways that an authoritarian system could constrain life on the ground, insufficient accountability leading to corruption and inefficiency, and there was no shortage of local level injustices in the state. And so as I worked with the lawyers and NGOs that I worked with had to confront these political pressures. And the academic work I do these days really tries to grapple with this the tensions between these two sides. So the final thing I'll just say is that these days we're heading into even a new era with new questions about China. I think China, to me, feels like it's here to stay and its influence will only grow stronger in the coming years. And some questions that we need to grapple with going forward is that whereas 25 years ago it felt as though democracy was ascendant and the end of history was near, we now face a global situation where many democracies are faltering or in trouble and dealing with authoritarian impulses and populist movements. And I think that this tension between sort of liberal democratic values and China's model needs to be better understood and grappled with as many developing countries begin to look at China as a potential model as the US begins to retreat from the world. And also now as China has more influence in the world than ever before, it's engaging with governments and businesses all around the world. This Sunday in the New York Times, there's an article about China's new colonialism, its engagements and investment in Sri Lanka. The same author wrote a piece a few months ago about Chinese engagement in Namibia. There's a lot of press this week about Chinese engagement in Australia and their alleged state efforts to censor academics who talk about China in ways that are not sanctioned or sort of approved of by the state. I think on balance, my view is that we have to take a balanced view about these things. Hysteria over Chinese influence is often tinged with xenophobia, yet there are genuine differences in values that need to be grappled with as sort of a rising power confronts an existing power. And we also shouldn't forget that there are many potential benefits with engagement with China. In the area I work on, in environment and renewable energy, China's commitment to renewable energy has lowered the prices and driven technological development for solar and wind and other types of technology, and China's providing investment and jobs in the rest of the world. And so this influence, for better or worse, is something that I think we'll be grappling with for many years to come. And so all that is to say that it's critical for us in the U.S. to better understand what's going on in China, and I'm proud to be part of UCLA Law's tradition of exploring this very important issue. So thank you very much.